Greetings, this is Ted A. Roberts with Seeking the Everlasting Gospel Ministries, and today we're starting on chapter 3 of my book, Satan, the Devil, and Hell, and this chapter is called Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, and Cyrus of their possible connection to Lucifer. And what this is a continuance of the last chapter that I began on Lucifer, of which subject is actually going to cover 3 chapters in this book, chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4, until we exhaust that subject. So everything that I'm going to be doing here has to do with Lucifer, but we're going to be looking at the historical side of the scriptures in this chapter here, and not anything metaphorical or spiritualized or anything like that. Not completely. So just bear with me as we go through this history lesson, because your Bibles is also a history book, just as much as it's a science book and a math book, which is good for homeschooling and stuff like that. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started here. Not only do I see Lucifer as to being an ancient mortal king of BC times, not some spirit being called the devil, but also I do not see this Lucifer as to be an Adam either. That is, first man Adam from the book of Genesis, as many others contend. One of the main clues that many of them use, if not the main clue, is this statement right here in Isaiah 14:12a. How are you fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? This is calling this Lucifer the son of the morning, a title that could certainly insinuate that this man was very powerful and special. Then in turn connecting such an idea to the second Adam, Jesus, as Paul so calls him, a second Adam in 1 Corinthians 15:45, who is the bright and morning star, as we see in Revelation 22:16b. I'm the root and offspring of David and the bright and morning star. Therefore, as many say, first Adam was the son of the morning, Adam being referenced as such in Isaiah 14. And Jesus, the second Adam of the New Testament, was the bright and morning star. Some even going as far as to say that Lucifer was Jesus, because the definition of Lucifer denotes such. So let's go to Lucifer from Strong's Hebrew Dictionary, in the sense of brightness, the morning star. Lucifer, that's what it means. And, of course, this is only to be found one time in the King James Version. However, that's where the larger comparisons actually stop, but is, as many see it, good enough to build an entire case. Then they'll connect smaller hints and clues along the way to further their beliefs. That is, that Lucifer was first man Adam, and that these verses in Isaiah were a look back to those earlier days of Genesis, but also, as we're actually going to get into in the very next chapter, many people continue to connect Lucifer / Adam to the king of Tyrus from the book of Ezekiel as well. Again, that's going to be our subject for chapter 4. Such a position, however, does not explain how and why Adam was also known as, this really was Adam, why he was known as the king of Babylon in Isaiah's book. Unless we can say, spiritually speaking, and as I've already suggested in an explanatory note from the last chapter, of which note was called the king of Babylon, that the title was only an allegorical way of saying the king of confusion. That the title was an allegorical way of saying the king of confusion. But there are other problems with Lucifer being Adam, and of Isaiah's possible comparison, because Lucifer is not the only story told in Isaiah as to being a monarch to a kingdom or a nation that would fall. Lucifer's story is only the beginning of the tellings of several nations' follies, and of their fall also. See Isaiah 14:28 through 29a, which talks about the Philistines. Isaiah 15:1 talks about Moab. Isaiah 17:1 talks about Damascus. Isaiah 18:1 talks about Ethiopia, and Isaiah 19:1 that talks about Egypt, of which scriptures I'm going to show a little bit more on in a few moments. which not only were not nations that were contemporaries with first man Adam in Genesis, but such passages about these other nations can certainly bring us right back from the world of mystery and spiritual insights into simpler historical situations instead, because these can't all be metaphorical stories of Satan and or of Adam. They can't be. And why spiritualize the first story about a fallen nation or a mysterious king and then naturalize the rest of them as actual historical events? Not only but to seriously understand Lucifer and of whom he may have been in history, if again he wasn't either Adam or Satan, we do ourselves a huge favor by trying to comprehend the meaning behind chapter 13 of Isaiah before we can even try and tackle Lucifer's story in chapter 14. Since assuredly chapter 14 is simply a continuance of 13's beginning. But before attempting to do so, allow me to add one last thought, that even if a person were bent upon spiritualizing chapter 13 and 14 of Isaiah, that is in a way that either depicts a future that's beyond our own time, or even depicts in great symbolism either Adam's story or the devil's story, and that we can't naturalize them into a history lesson about the historic city of Babylon and of its devastating fate from a natural war, then at least consider that in many cases, before we can even have a spiritually understood event, a natural counterpart could certainly have happened beforehand. We're going to actually see logic to that thought when we discover, as we carry on, that the nation who would destroy Babylon during the BC times was actually named by Isaiah in chapter 13 of his book, of which nation, who was referenced in actual history, really did destroy that nation. So with that last thought, let's begin our investigation with the first warning to Babylon and of its inevitable destruction. We see that in Isaiah 13:1, the burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz did see. Now we have with that our first explanatory note, number 1, called the burden of Babylon. Once again, this type of announcement, the burden of Babylon, very similar to the warnings of other nations in the chapters to come in Isaiah, the first even being in the same chapter with Lucifer's story. So let's go down these promised scriptures that I had promised to expound upon a little bit more. So let's go to Isaiah 14:28a. In the year that the king Ahaz died was this burden. Rejoice not thou with Palestina, the Philistines. Isaiah 15:1a. The burden of Moab. Isaiah 17:1a. The burden of Damascus. Isaiah 18:1. Woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. Isaiah 19:1a. The burden of Egypt. All right. So let's go back to the main part of the book and let's reread Isaiah 13:1. The burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz did see. Now, this verse sets up a prophetic warning to the actual city of Babylon, and perhaps not to some mystical king of confusion, that a literal war would commence against them in the future, and that they will utterly be destroyed. For, and as I've just mentioned, the nation as to whom would destroy them, the Medes, is actually named as their conquerors. In verse 17a, it says, Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them.